So I recently watched Lord of the Rings for, I want to say, the 300th time, and this recent watch through really instilled a passion in me to dive deeper into the lore of the Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth. So I wanted to make a video just kind of talking about some really cool Lord of the Rings facts. I know this might be the nerdiest video I've ever made, but that's alright. And this is a topic I'm pretty sure I could talk about all day, but I'm going to try to limit this video to like 10 cool things. So without further ado, here's 10 cool things about Lord of the Rings that you might not have known. So when understanding Lord of the Rings lore, we kind of have to look back and view how sort of the world itself works and how the religion works. Because similarly to our world, they have a god. Only instead of God, his name is Eru-Ilúvatar, which is a really sick name. And directly under him, or it, whatever you want to call it, are what are called the Valar, which I like to think of them as sort of like God's angels. You know, they work directly under Eru-Ilúvatar, and they each sort of have a different task or purpose as to what they are. So, for example, there might be a Valar of crafting, or a Valar of hope, or a Valar of the water, you know? And then directly under that, there is another race called the Maiar. And using the same analogy, the Maiar are basically what you would consider like demigods. You know, they still have a great amount of power. They still are immortal in a sense, but they're not as powerful as the Valar. And so what's really interesting about the Maiar is a lot of the characters in the Lord of the Rings are actually Maiar, or were Maiar, I should say. So for example, Gandalf was actually a Maiar before he became what is known as an Istari, or a wizard. And the Maiar in Tolkien's universe sort of directly relate to another Valar. So for example, I believe that Gandalf, when he was still a Maiar, his name was actually Alorin, which, by the way, side note, is the sickest name of all time, and I have planned to name one of my kids Alorin for as long as I can remember. But Alorin was both known as one of the wisest Maiar there were, but also studied under the Valar of Mercy, which sort of, you know, plays into his character later on, which I think is really interesting. Saruman was also a Maiar and studied under the Valar of Crafting, known as Aule. I've probably butchered that, but yes, the Valar of Crafting. Now that in and of itself is really interesting because the Valar of Crafting only had one other apprentice, and that apprentice's name was Mairon. Now that might not be sending red flags up and down your spine, but Mairon later became Sauron. So it's interesting that two Maiar who studied under Aule in order to kind of learn how to craft great rings, hint hint, later became evil. And also I should kind of note that in the actual Lord of the Rings, like the books, Saruman never really wanted to work with Sauron. He wanted to do his own thing. He wanted to be the Lord of the Rings. Like, he wanted to make his own fucking rings of power. He wanted to do his own thing. It was really only in the movies that they kind of worked together. But this is sort of alluded to when Gandalf is trapped up on Orthanc, the tower in Isengard. And then Saruman comes up there, and just before Gandalf flies away with the eagles, he says, "There is only one Lord of the Rings, and he does not share power."
There is only one Lord of the Rings. Only one who can bend it to his will. And he does not share power.
Which is sort of like a, oh shit, like he went there kind of line, but it is also referencing the fact that Saruman wanted to be a Lord of the Rings. And since we're on the topic of the Great Rings, there are a couple other facts about the rings themselves that are really interesting. So obviously, if you've seen the intro of Lord of the Rings, everyone knows that, you know, 3 rings were given to the elves, 7 were given to dwarf lords, and then 9 rings were gifted to the race of men, who above all else desire power. So a really interesting thing about the individual properties of specifically the elf rings. So a lot of people know that Galadriel has one of the rings called Nenya, which have the properties of prolonging her life as well as hiding all of the people that she has in Lothlorien. And when I think of hiding, I think of like the invisibility cloak from Harry Potter, how it basically like you are invisible to evil in a sense. So it's not that Lothlorien is just a hidden spot and like no one can see it, it's that it is hidden from evil. Another ring eventually finds its way to Elrond, known as Vilya. And the interesting thing about Vilya is that it is a ring of healing, which a lot of people, including myself, have speculated that when Frodo was stabbed at Weathertop and he needed elvish medicine, and they bring him to Rivendell, that ring is actually what causes Frodo to feel better. So kind of cool little side fact there. But also, in addition to it being a healing ring, is also a ring that prolongs Elrond's life and the lives of the people in Rivendell. The most interesting thing about the 3 Elvish rings is that the other one, the entirety of Lord of the Rings, was actually Gandalf who had possession of it. The Ring of Narya, or the Ring of Fire, which some of you may remember in Khazad-dûm when he's facing the Balrog, he says,
I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor.
But this is sort of an unknown thing all through Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Like, we don't really see that Gandalf has one of the rings, but this story of how he gets it is actually really interesting. And that takes us to learning more about the wizards, or the Istari, which was basically the Valar and Eru Ilúvatar's direct way to handle Sauron. So of the 5 wizards, we know Radagast the Brown, Gandalf the Grey, Saruman the White, and then the 2 mystical blue wizards. And what's really interesting about the 2 blue wizards is that in a letter that Tolkien wrote later in his life, he shed more light on the blue wizards and actually stated that they came first and that they were sort of a trial wizard, if you will. And so as we know, all of the wizards in Middle-earth have a kind of different purpose. Like, if you are a white wizard, you are the leader of the wizards. It doesn't really necessarily mean you're any more powerful than the other wizards. It's just you have a different purpose. So the white wizards are always like the kind of military leaders, if you want to call it that, but also the leader of the Istari. Radagast, the brown wizard, he kind of takes care of the birds and beasts. And while it's not ever really stated, Gandalf's purpose is the people. He's there to be a direct line to the actual humanity of Middle-earth. Because if you really think about it, like, Gandalf is fucking everywhere. He has been everywhere, right? Ain't no one in Middle-earth that doesn't know Gandalf, right? And this makes sense even more knowing what we know about him and being studying under the Valar of Mercy. But how the Istari actually came into the world is how a lot of the elves of Lord of the Rings leave the world, sailing west from the Grey Havens into Valinor. So essentially, the 5 wizards came from Valinor, sailed east into the Grey Havens, and they are met by one of the coolest elves, by the way, a guy named Círdan the Shipwright, who, side fact, is the only elf in Lord of the Rings history that is known to have grown a beard. Don't know why I know that, but yes. So Círdan the Shipwright was the other elf lord that actually got the last ring of Narya. And when the Istari came ashore, and he was, introduced to Radagast and Saruman and Gandalf, he was so blown away by Gandalf's presence and humility that he literally just gave Gandalf Narya and said, you're gonna need this more than I will. Which is crazy, and I love that. But it also kind of is extra interesting because, as we know, Saruman wanted to be a ring bearer. He wanted to be the Lord of the Rings, right? And so to have his first interaction into the world of Middle-earth being that someone gives Gandalf a ring of power, but not him, it really just fueled his character becoming more villainous even more. Not even to mention that when the White Council was formed, Círdan the Shipwright was actually part of it. We have, of course, Elrond and Galadriel and Saruman and Gandalf. But when it was actually formed, everyone wanted Gandalf to be the leader of it, not Saruman. And so again, it's just Saruman really having this kind of pent-up hatred towards Gandalf and be like, why does he get everything? I don't get anything. So this knowledge of knowing what the rings do for the elves kind of adds this additional weight and sacrifice that the elves have to give up, knowing that Frodo is going to destroy the One Ring. Therefore, Galadriel's prolonged life and Elrond's prolonged life and them being hidden from evil is no longer applicable. Which is also why there's so much focus in the Lord of the Rings about the Age of Men, is because once those powers are gone and the elves aren't living as long, it truly will be the Age of Men. So yeah, if you really think about it, Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf really have a reason not to have Frodo go and destroy this ring, because they want that. I mean, in self-preservation, it makes sense, but they know that that is the correct thing to do. That's the right thing to do. Now, not a lot is known about the dwarvish rings and who they went to, but it is interesting to know that the dwarves are actually resistant to the evil of Sauron, and that the only negative effects that they really got from wearing the rings was increased greed. And so it could be argued that the wearing of those rings are what caused the 7 great gold hordes of the dwarves, and thus causing later Smaug and the other dragons to come. And also a really interesting fun fact about the dwarves is that the same crafting Valar, Aule, got so fed up with men and elves and not being able to teach them crafting that he literally made his own race of dwarves as a race that would appreciate crafting. Which I just think is so funny. Yo, fuck this! I'm doing my own thing! It's just great. Now, when it comes to the 9 rings of power that went to men, who later became the ring wraiths, as well as the One Ring, there's some really interesting things about those that we can observe in Tolkien lore. Firstly, while some of the men that received those rings were kings, a lot of them weren't, which is kind of interesting. Kind of makes you wonder who the hell they were. And the men, for whatever reason, got so corrupted by Sauron that they ceased to exist in a physical form and became a slave to Sauron. Because something that not a lot of people know is that the black figures that we see that represent the ring wraiths are not their actual physical form. They don't have one. They are, it is said in The Lord of the Rings that, like Gandalf says, they are disguised as riders in black because they don't have a real physical form.
Disguised as riders in black.
Their physical form actually only exists now in the Wraith world, which is the same world that Frodo sees whenever he puts on the ring. So a really great visual representation of this is when Frodo puts on the ring on Weathertop, he's actually able to see a kind of different version of the ring wraiths than we're used to seeing, and that is showing their actual form. And I know I've said this 1,000 times, but another really interesting thing specifically about the One Ring is that a lot of people think that when you put on that one ring, you just turn invisible. That's its magical property. You're just invisible now. But what it actually does is it teleports you to the Wraith world, which is why the more time that Frodo spends there, the more of an a-hole he becomes. And also it makes total sense that if the ring wraiths live in this Wraith world, whenever Frodo puts it on, they're able to see him more clearly. If once again we look at kind of the events of what happened on Weathertop, the second he puts that on, every ring wraith can see him. Whereas when you think about like when they're on the road going to Bree, that ring wraith can't actually see him. Whereas if he would have put the ring on, he would have then been able to be seen. So we all know that Sauron is the big baddie of the Lord of the Rings, right? But what isn't really told about him and kind of his backstory of like when he was still Myron, a Maiar, is the thing that corrupted him. Because before Sauron, there was a greater evil of the world named Morgoth. And Morgoth is referenced in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies, but essentially Morgoth is Satan to Eru Ilúvatar. It's basically the opposite of God. And also similarly to Satan and God, I believe that Morgoth was a fallen Valar. So Sauron was technically the second evil, and his reign didn't actually last that long. And after he was gone, the greatest evil for, I want to say, thousands of years in Middle-earth was one of his lackeys, who we know as the Witch King of Angmar. Now, I love the Witch King of Angmar. I think his story is really interesting. And what is especially kind of gnarly about his character is that he had the longest reign of terror on Middle-earth, and it's kind of, we don't know that, you know, that's another interesting fact. The Witch King of Angmar almost single-handedly is the reason that Aragorn is not on the throne, that the Kingdom of Men isn't this great prospering nation. Basically, originally, there were two kingdoms of man. There was Gondor and Arnor to the north. So Isildur, the guy that we know is Aragorn's ancestor, the one who didn't throw the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, his dad, Elendil, was the ruler of Arnor, where then Isildur and his brother, I forgot his name, something with an A, they founded and ruled over the kingdom of Gondor to the south. So even after Elendil fell in the War of the Ring, and after Isildur kind of very shortly after followed him, the kingdom of Arnor really for the longest time couldn't figure its shit out or get on its feet because the Witch King of Angmar just kept fucking their shit for years. Battle after battle. I mean, there were some that the humans won. Don't get me wrong, but they never took out the Witch King of Angmar, and so he just kept coming back because he's fucking invincible, a nasty, nasty man. And something also interesting about the Witch King of Angmar is that he comes from the same line of men that Aragorn did, known as the Númenóreans, which also explains why Aragorn fears the ring even more, because he knows what the ring can do to, you know, the men in his line. But yes, the Witch King of Angmar is the reason that there is a steward sitting on the throne of Gondor. He is the reason that Arnor doesn't exist anymore, and he is the reason that Aragorn is the last motherfucking descendant of the line of Isildur. So yes, anyways, those are some of the interesting facts about Lord of the Rings that I wanted to tell you guys about today. I could talk about this all day, and in fact, if you want more of it, you know, let me know, because I can come back anytime. Either way, hopefully you guys found this interesting, and also leave in the comments down below any kind of retort that you have about any of the things I talked about, whether you found it interesting or some, you know, other stuff that you want to know about. That said, thank you all so much for watching. I will see you next time, and fair winds.